All right, so this is topic 14 again. So topic 14, and this is where you're going to be looking at these ideas: domain, range, intercepts, and finding function values. And then we're going to talk about this one right here. For what values of x is g of x equal to 5? Is g of x equal to negative 1? What does that mean? It's not difficult. It is not difficult. Okay, as you go through this, it is important you understand what an open circle means. It is important that you understand what a closed circle means. Okay? All right. And it's also important you understand, well, what does an arrow mean? If you see an arrow, what does that mean in terms of domain and range? All that's important. What does that mean in terms of domain and range? Okay, so we're going to do number one. And here the question is number one. You want to find the domain, range, and this other information that you see. Remember, the domain is a set of x coordinates. The range is a set of y coordinates. Domain is a set of x coordinates. The range is a set of y coordinates. So the question is this: if I want to find the domain of this function, and by the way, this is a function because it passes the vertical line test. So if I want to find the domain of this function, I'm asking myself, what are these x values that are on this line? If I want to find the range of this function, I'm asking myself, what are the y values that are on this graph? That's what you're asked. Now there are a couple ways you can think about this. So one way is to use maybe a straight edge to help you. And here's the idea. So remember, the domain is a set of x coordinates. So when you think about the domain, think about going along the x-axis. Think about going along the x-axis. When you think about range, think about going along the y-axis. So notice I went from bottom up. Because whenever you write the domain and range, you're going to be using an interval. And when you talk about an interval, you go from smallest to largest. So domain, you go from left to right along the x-axis. So this is your x-axis. This is your y-axis. The range, you go from bottom up along the y-axis. So let's talk about the domain. So you have this arrow here. So the arrow means it keeps going. Okay, that's important to understand. All right. So notice that the domain, since this arrow keeps going, it's kind of like it's pushing this ruler away. So I'm going from the idea of negative infinity all the way, and keep going until you get to this point here where it stops. See, that's not an arrow, so you got to stop. But it's open, so that's going to mean something in terms of domain and range. So it's open. So if it's open, it means that this point is not on the graph. It's not part of the graph. So it's not going to be part of the domain. It is not going to be part of the range. Well, if it's not part of the domain and it's not part of the range, how do we deal with it in terms of the interval? Well, here's how we're going to do it. Okay, so you see this arrow. So this arrow, think about this arrow as pushing it away. It's pushing this ruler away. So think about negative infinity all the way, and then it stops here. And then you ask yourself, what is this x value right here? Well, this x value is 8. That's an 8 right here. All right, so how do you write this? Here's how you write it. Whenever, and listen carefully, whenever your domain and range has infinity or negative infinity, you will always use parentheses. So you can say parentheses negative infinity, and here's how you write the infinity symbol. Make sure you learn how to write the infinity symbol. So it's kind of like a sideways 8. So negative infinity, comma, all right, now listen carefully. So you're going from negative infinity all the way to this x value. Remember, the domain set of x coordinates, this x value. Well, that x value here is 8. Since that's an open circle, that's not part of the graph, that's not part of my domain, I have to use parentheses. So my domain is going from negative infinity to negative 8. Now let's talk about the range. Now when we get to this one, see, this has a closed circle, so you can see what the difference is. So now let's look at the range. For the range, remember you go from along the y-axis, but go from bottom up because you got to go from smallest to largest. So same idea here. See this arrow? So this arrow is pushing this ruler down, so it's going towards the idea of negative infinity. So you're going from negative infinity, and then you tell me where to stop. Well, you stop here because that's the end of the graph right here. So that you got to look at this y value. So this y value here is also 8. See that? That's an 8. But it's open. It's open. So I'm going from negative infinity all the way to this y value because I'm talking about range now. So you're looking at your y's, and that y value is positive 8 this time. Positive 8. So I'm going from negative infinity to positive 8 with parentheses. So remember, negative infinity and positive infinity is always parentheses. And I'm going to use parentheses here because of this open circle. So that's why I use parentheses. Let's talk about domain and range for the other one, and we'll come back to this. Domain and range for the other one, number 2. So let's get this one. So remember, domain is you go along your x-axis. You always go from left to right because you're going from smallest to largest. Now this time, notice this time the arrow's on the right-hand side. See, it's on the right-hand side. There is no arrow on the left side. So this is where you start. This is where you start. So you start, in this case, negative 8. That's a negative 8 right here. But it's closed. It's closed. So you're going from negative 8. You're going from negative 8. And then you see this arrow means it keeps on going. It doesn't stop. So you're going from negative 8 all the way to positive. So you're going this way. So that's positive infinity going this way. Going positive infinity. So negative 8, positive infinity. So my domain will be positive 8 with a bracket. Notice the difference. Parentheses, bracket. So you got to ask yourself, well, why is this parentheses? Why is this bracket? Well, that's bracket and parentheses because of this. Open circle, parentheses, closed circle, bracket. All right, and so you're going from positive infinity. I'm sorry, 8 to positive infinity. Now remember, whenever you have infinity or negative infinity in your domain and range, you will always use parentheses. Never use brackets with it. It's always parentheses. All right, let's talk about the range now. The range. So the range, you go from bottom up along the y-axis. But notice this arrow is pointing down, so it's kind of like moving this ruler down. So you're going from negative infinity, all the way, and then you stop here. So this is where you stop. But notice this y value is a positive 9, and this is closed. So positive 9, and it's closed. So your range in terms of an interval, you're going to say negative infinity to positive 9 with a bracket. So let's talk about why it's a bracket. So remember, bracket here, because this is closed. What's that y value? That y value is 9. Parentheses, you always use parentheses when you're dealing with negative infinity or infinity. All right, so that's domain and range. All right, now let's just kind of complete this right here. The x-intercept, remember the x-intercept is where the graph crosses the x-axis, and the y-intercept is where the graph crosses the y-axis. Now here's the thing you got to remember. In the directions, they will ask you to write this as an ordered pair. So always make sure you read the directions carefully. They're asking you to write this as an ordered pair. So let's talk about the x-intercept. So the x-intercept is where the graph crosses the x-axis. Now you're going to have to estimate this one. See, this is where the graph crosses the x-axis right here. So let's just estimate this. So to the nearest tenth, that kind of looks like the graph crosses the x-axis at 2.5. So 2.5. So I'm gonna put 2. I'm sorry. So remember, you got to write an order pair, right? So x is 2.5. Your y value is 0. So 2.5 comma 0. Now, don't let all of these brackets and parentheses throw you off. Whenever you're dealing with intercepts, remember intercepts in an ordered pair, you always write an ordered pair as parentheses. The only time right now, the only time you're going to worry about brackets is if you're dealing with domain and range. The only time you worry about brackets is if you're dealing with domain and range. All this other stuff with ordered pairs, it's always parentheses because it's an ordered pair. You're looking at a point. Okay, now the y-intercept. The y-intercept is here. That's where the graph crosses the y-axis. That's 4. So your y-intercept, if you think about it, that's 0. I'm sorry, negative 4. 0, negative 4. So that's your y-intercept. So it does say an ordered pair, so make sure you write it correctly. Don't put negative 4, 0, because negative 4, 0 is on the x-axis. 0, negative 4 is on the y-axis. All right? Now, they want you to find g of 4. So remember what that means. That means that when x is 4, what's the y value? When x is 4, what's the y value? Well, go to your graph. See, this is 4 right here, right? See where x is 4? Right here? You use a rule if you have to. When x is 4, here's the point. Right here. So the ordered pair for that point, is 4 comma 2. So when x is 4, what's your y value? The y value is 2. So the answer here is 2. That's the answer. And now let's do this one, g of 8. So g of 8. So the question now is, what's the y value when x is 8? So when x is 8, that's this right here. Now be careful. Remember, that's not part of the graph, right? So don't say, and if you put an ordered pair, this open circle represents the point 8, comma 8. So don't say the answer is 8. Don't put an 8 here, because that's not your y value. This is an open circle. So when x is 8, the point does not exist, because it's open. So what you got to say here is this. You got to say does not exist, because it's an open circle. All right, so it's important you know the difference between an open circle and a closed circle. All right, now here's where some students get a little confused. And make sure you go back and you look at those lessons that deal with topic 14. So this says this, for what value of x does g of x equal to 5? And then what value of x does g of x equal to negative 1? It helps if you think of this right here as y. Think of g of x as y. So the question is this, when y is 5, when y equals 5, what's the x value? When y equals negative 1, what's the x value? So here's the way I would think about this. When y is 5, here's where y is 5 right here. See the y is 5? 5 on the y-axis right here. Use your ruler and look at the point that's associated with it. That's this right here. Label that point. So that point is 6, comma 5. So when y is 5, what's the x value? The x value is 6. So put a 6 here. The answer is 6. So when y is 5, the x value is 6. Let's look at this one. When y is negative 1. So on the y-axis, here's where negative 1 is. Here's the point that goes with it. You use a rule if you need to. Negative 1, here's the point. Then I would label it. So this is 2, negative 1 right here. That's the point. This right here is the point 2, negative 1. So when y is negative 1, what's the x value? The x value is 2. So 2 goes here. All right, let's look at this one. I know we're out of time, but let me just kind of finish this right here, just so it'll get you something to get started with. So let's talk about this one. So remember, closed circle, arrow. The x-intercept, y-intercept. The x-intercept is where the graph crosses the x-axis. The y-intercept is where the graph crosses the x-axis. And you are told to put this as an ordered pair. So you have to write this as a point. And remember, when you write a point, always use parentheses. So the x-intercept looks like it's about here. See it right here? So that's negative 1. So you're going to say negative 1, comma 0. The y-intercept, that's this right here. So we have to estimate this one. So let's estimate this to be, it looks like maybe negative 1.7. Just do the best you can. Negative 1.7. So you're going to say 0, negative 1.7. We have to estimate that one. Now let's go about k of negative 5. So remember what that means. That means when x is negative 5, what's the y value? When x is negative 5, what's the y value? So here's on the x-axis, locate negative 5 on the x-axis. That's here. You use your ruler. So that's this right here. Okay, that's the point that's associated with it. Label that point. So that's negative 5, comma, positive 5. So now let's go back to the question. What is k of negative 5? When x is negative 5, what's the y value? Well, when x is negative 5, the y value is 5. So 5 goes here. Let's look at this one, k of negative 8. K of negative 8, that's just right here. When x is negative 8, what's the y value? Notice this time it's a closed circle, right? So that exists. So when I label the point negative 8, 9, so that's a 9 here. Remember right over here, I said does not exist. That was because this was an open circle. An open circle is not part of the graph. Here, though, this is a closed circle. That is part of the graph. So when x is negative 8, I do get a y value, and that y value is 9. So k of negative 8 is equal to 9. And then finally, let's look at this one. So these two are the same idea. For what value of x does k of x equal 1? So remember, think of k of x as your y value. So when y is 1, what's my x value? So when y is 1, so here's on the y-axis where y is 1, locate that point right here. So that's this right here. Label that point. Label it. So that's negative 2, 1. This point right here is negative 2, 1. So when y is 1, what's the x value? When y is 1, the x value is negative 2. So when y is 1, the x value is negative 2. That's the answer. All right. So I went 7 minutes over, but there were some other things I wanted to talk about in terms of what you're going to be dealing with Tuesday and Wednesday that I didn't get to. But there are lessons there in those topics when you get to them. So make sure you're looking at those lessons. Most students don't have trouble with this. If you study those lessons, those videos, you'll get it. That is not a difficult concept for students. You just got to go back and kind of review each time. What happens if I have an open circle? What happens if I have a closed circle? What happens if I have arrows? All right. Okay, so that took us about 18 minutes to kind of go over those two ideas.